I was thinking about the fact that it's actually quite a long story. I feel like the feminist identity predated me, so I kind of feel like I was sort of fortunate enough to be born into a family where that was probably a given, but that would be my identity, even though there wasn't a language necessarily for it. So having said that, I just was born in Russia. In terms of kind of just a long line of women on both sides of my family, grandmothers, great-grandmothers who were all really well educated. On my mom's side, my grandmother was an army physician and then an emergency medicine physician for her entire life. My mom has a PhD in comparative literature, was an academic for most of her life as well. And on my dad's side, my grandmother, who trained as a nurse, didn't actually end up doing that, but certainly was well educated. So I kind of come from a long line of where the assumption is that women have the same rights in terms of certainly employment. I mean, certainly it's not the case that there was equity always familiarly in terms of other roles and household duties and those kinds of things. Like those continue to be problems in Russia as here as elsewhere. But certainly there was an assumption that a woman's voice and a woman's place at work and at home was equal, and sometimes even more than equal in certain domains. So I feel like it started before I was there, and certainly I was an only child too, which in some ways was probably quite helpful because there were no comparisons about anything. So I was treated as very loved and cared for and respected person, actually, from an early age by both my parents, and the expectations for things like participation in math and science and all those things were just never a question. I loved math, I loved playing with numbers, I loved science, that was never discouraged. There was never any discussion of you will do something else or whatever. So I feel like it's a long story in some ways, but a really good story in the sense that the language of feminism wasn't always in the household, but it was in my environment that I lived and breathed, that there was no question that an interest in equity and justice, and not just about justice about rights that had to do with men and women, but just sort of activism and discussions, conversations that were always had in the house, political discussions and access to art and literature and history, and an awareness that one needs to be a full citizen, to be enculturated in a range of ways, right, about a range of issues. So it's
what a great environment.
It's been there. Yeah, I'm not saying it was a blissful home environment in every other way. Families are always complicated, but certainly in terms of those issues, there was never any question that being a woman was not a barrier to anything. I never had to explain or fight for those kinds of things in my family. I was encouraged to do that. And certainly as I was getting older, there were more explicit probably pronouncements and coaching about that, I think, from both my parents, because they were both aware of the fact that as a woman, and as a young woman, and a woman who also might get certain kinds of attention, that there were certainly conversations about what do you want to be valued for, and what are the priorities, and appearance versus intellect and other kinds of things, right? So that we certainly had conversations about those kinds of things too. That what do you want the world to pay attention to? Right. So it started pretty early.
Yeah. And do you remember when, because you said this kind of like predated the language of feminism.
Right.
Do you remember when that, I guess, label or that theory or that movement became a part of your awareness or identity? Like more formally?
Probably in high school, although again I don't remember the word feminism being used explicitly, but I certainly remember teachers who were using assignments to deconstruct and address gender and address discrimination, those kinds of things, and discussion topics and debates that were being kind of set up as assignments for us to look at sexism, look at lack of equity and those kinds of things. So again, it's interesting that I don't remember the use of the word feminist explicitly until university, but that conversation was certainly being had in other ways.